when confidence replaced understanding. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. There was a time when feeling sad did not mean you were overwhelmed, exhausted, or reacting normally to a difficult life. It meant something inside you was clogged. Literally clogged. Somewhere deep within your body, an invisible fluid had stalled, thickened, and begun to misbehave. And the solution was not reflection, rest, or comfort. It was a bowl, a blade, and the calm confidence of someone who was absolutely certain they knew what was wrong with you. Medieval psychology did not ask how you felt. It asked what needed to be drained. And that, oddly enough, made people feel safer. Because certainty is soothing, especially at night. In the medieval world, fear was everywhere. Disease arrived without warning. Death moved quickly and without explanation. Crops failed. Winters lasted too long. Wars came uninvited. And in a world like that, not knowing why something happened was often more terrifying than the thing itself. Uncertainty was the real enemy. So medieval thinkers did what humans have always done when knowledge runs out and anxiety takes over. They filled the silence with answers. Confident answers. Simple answers. Answers that explained everything, even if they explained nothing correctly. This is where medieval psychology begins. Not as a science of understanding the mind, but as a system for making the world feel manageable. The goal was never to explore the inner life of a person. It was to restore order, to assign cause, to locate blame, to make suffering predictable. If sadness could be reduced to a substance, then it could be measured. If anger came from heat, then it could be cooled. If fear was a circulation problem, then it could be warmed. And if love itself was a kind of illness, then at least it had a diagnosis. The mind, mysterious and frightening, was gently pushed aside. In its place came fluids, temperatures, organs, stars, and moral rules. Things that felt solid, things that could be controlled. This episode is not about how medieval people were foolish. They were not. They were deeply human. They were living without neuroscience, without psychology, without an understanding of trauma, hormones, or the brain itself. What they had instead was tradition, religion, observation filtered through fear, and a powerful belief that the universe must make sense. And so they built a psychology that explained sadness without empathy, anger without context, love without joy, and fear without mercy. A psychology that worked beautifully as long as no one asked whether it was true. The tone of this story is quiet, late, unhurried, because medieval psychology itself moved slowly, confidently, without doubt. There was no sense of, we're still researching this. There were no footnotes of uncertainty. If you were unhappy, they knew why. If you were angry, they knew where the heat came from. If you dreamed too vividly, they knew who was watching you. And if you questioned any of it, well, that only proved the diagnosis. At its core, medieval psychology was not interested in understanding people. It was interested in managing them. It turned emotions into maintenance problems, thoughts into risks, curiosity into a medical liability, silence into therapy, obedience into health, and suffering into something meaningful, purposeful, and therefore acceptable. Pain was not something to fix. It was something to endure correctly. There is a strange comfort in that idea. If pain has a reason, then it is not random. If suffering has a cause, then it is not meaningless. Medieval psychology offered something modern life often struggles to provide a complete explanation. It explained sadness, fear, love, madness, dreams, joy, anger, women, children, and even happiness itself, all within one neat system. Everything fit, everything had a place, and nothing was allowed to remain unresolved. Of course, the system was wrong. Black bile does not exist. Thinking does not overheat the brain. Love cannot be cured with cold baths. Fear is not cowardice, and silence does not heal the mind. But medieval psychology did not survive for centuries because it was accurate. It survived because it was confident. Confidence, delivered calmly and without hesitation, is persuasive, especially when the alternative is admitting that no one truly knows what is happening inside the human mind. As we move through this story tonight, we are not just exploring medieval beliefs. We are watching the birth of a very familiar pattern, the human desire for simple explanations, the comfort of blaming the body instead of confronting pain, the temptation to turn complex inner lives into tidy rules. Medieval psychology is not a relic. It is a mirror. One held at a distance, yes, but a mirror nonetheless. So settle in, slow your breathing, let the day loosen its grip. Tonight we are entering a world where emotions were liquids, thoughts were dangerous, love was a diagnosis, and confidence mattered far more than understanding. And as strange as it sounds, this is not a story about how far we've come. It is a story about how easily certainty replaces compassion when fear is allowed to speak first. And that is the quiet, unsettling lesson medieval psychology still whispers to us long after the blood bowls have been put away. Before medieval psychology tried to understand how people felt, it decided something far simpler, that emotions were not experiences at all, but substances quietly pooling inside the body, waiting to be drained. Sadness was not a feeling, it was a plumbing issue. In the medieval mind, emotions were not mysterious inner experiences waiting to be understood. They were substances, tangible, measurable, and most importantly, removable. Sadness did not arrive because life was hard, unfair, or exhausting. It arrived because something inside you had pooled where it should not have. A dark, cold substance known as black bile had settled into your body like emotional sediment, and once it did, everything else followed. Melancholy, brooding, despair, excessive thought, silence. All of it traced back to the same conclusion. You were not sad, you were full. This was not metaphor. Medieval psychology meant this literally. The human body, according to medieval medical theory, was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance. And emotions, inconveniently subtle and difficult to predict, were folded neatly into this system. Sadness became black bile. Joy became blood. Anger belonged to yellow bile. Calmness, such as it was allowed to exist, was phlegm behaving itself. Every feeling had a fluid. Every fluid had a temperature. And every problem had a procedure. Black bile in particular was deeply suspicious. It was cold, it was dry, it was heavy, and it liked to linger. When medieval doctors described melancholy, they did not speak of grief or loss or fatigue. They spoke of accumulation, a build-up, a blockage, something that had failed to circulate properly. Sad people were not wounded by life. They were congested by themselves. This framing mattered because once sadness became a substance, it stopped being personal. You did not need to ask what had happened to someone. You did not need to consider their circumstances. You did not need to listen. You only needed to locate the excess and remove it. Understanding was optional. Action was required. Medieval psychology did not ask why you were sad. It asked how much sadness you had and where it might be hiding. Silence, for example, was considered far more alarming than noise. A person who cried loudly was releasing something. That was healthy. A person who sat quietly, staring into the distance, thinking too much, was letting bile settle. Reflection was dangerous. Introspection was a warning sign. The mind turning inward was not growth. It was stagnation. Stillness meant something was collecting where it should not. In this worldview, a contemplative person was not thoughtful. They were risky. Doctors watched for it carefully. How often did you sigh? Did you speak slowly? Did you pause before answering questions? Did your eyes linger too long on nothing in particular? These were not signs of depth. They were symptoms, evidence that black bile had begun to assert itself. And once that assumption was made, the solution followed naturally. Remove it. How exactly does one remove sadness when sadness is a liquid? With enthusiasm. Bloodletting was the most popular option. Open a vein, drain the excess, restore balance. It was elegant in its simplicity. If blood could be removed, then bile could follow. If bile could leave the body, then sadness would leave with it. Vomiting was also encouraged. If emotions had entered through improper digestion, then reversing the process made sense. Laxatives cleared what bloodletting missed. Sweating forced impurities out through the skin. Fasting prevented new bile from forming. Occasionally, all of these were applied in rapid succession because moderation, like joy, was rarely trusted. Medieval medicine responded to emotional suffering with an impressive confidence that more suffering might solve it. The logic was internally consistent. If sadness made you weak, then weakening you further might push the sadness out first. If despair lingered, it meant the bile was stubborn. If the patient survived, the treatment was declared successful. If they did not, the problem was technically resolved. Either way, the system remained intact. There was no concept of emotional exhaustion, no allowance for grief, no recognition that living in a damp house, surrounded by illness, loss, and uncertainty, might reasonably produce despair. Medieval psychology did not deny suffering. It simply refused to interpret it as meaningful. Suffering was not information. It was malfunction. This approach had a certain appeal. Emotions are difficult. They resist measurement. They demand patience. Liquids are simpler. Liquids obey rules. They can be heated, cooled, drained, thickened, thinned. Turning feelings into fluids made them manageable. It replaced uncertainty with procedure. And in a world that feared chaos more than pain, that trade-off made sense. Thinking, unfortunately, made everything worse. Excessive thought was considered one of the primary causes of black bile accumulation. The mind, medieval scholars believed, was delicate, soft, moist, highly sensitive to activity. When you thought too much, you generated heat. That heat dried the brain. A dried brain cracked under pressure. Madness followed. This meant that introspection was not just unhelpful, it was medically irresponsible. A person who asked too many questions was not curious. They were overheating. Creative individuals were especially vulnerable. Poets, scholars, artists, philosophers. Anyone whose mind wandered beyond necessity was at risk. Imagination stirred the humors. Reflection disturbed balance. Late-night thinking was practically an invitation to illness. Medieval psychology tolerated creativity in small doses, preferably under supervision. Too much imagination produced sadness. Sadness required treatment. Treatment often killed the patient. It was, from the system's perspective, remarkably efficient. And yet, if the patient survived, the doctor took credit. Survival meant the bile had been managed. Death meant the imbalance had been severe. Either outcome confirmed the theory, there was no room for doubt. Doubt itself might have been considered a symptom. Grief was handled no differently. If your spouse died, medieval psychology did not recommend comfort, community, or time. Those were passive solutions. Grief was active, it moved, it collected, it needed intervention. Mourning that lingered too long became pathological. Tears were acceptable briefly as release. Silence was alarming. Prolonged sorrow meant bile had taken hold. The solution was not companionship. It was extraction. This did not make medieval people heartless. It made them consistent. Within this framework, emotions were not meant to be explored. They were meant to be regulated. Balance was the goal. Stillness was suspicious. Extremes were dangerous. And sadness, left untreated, threatened the entire system. A melancholy individual disrupted not just themselves, but the order around them. Their silence unsettled others. Their introspection challenged authority. Their grief resisted instruction. Better to drain it early. There is a quiet irony here. By turning sadness into a substance, medieval psychology acknowledged its power. It recognized that emotions could shape behavior, productivity, and stability. It simply chose the wrong explanation. Instead of asking what sadness meant, it asked how to remove it. Instead of listening, it measured. Instead of understanding, it acted. And this is the subtle cruelty of the system, not the bloodletting, not the vomiting, not even the starvation. The cruelty lay in the refusal to believe that sadness might be a response rather than a defect. Medieval doctors looked at emotion and said, "We do not understand this, so let us reduce it." That sentence quietly governs everything that follows. Once sadness became a problem of excess, moderation became a moral duty. Feel a little, but not too much. Think enough to work, pray, and obey, but not enough to question. Speak, but not too deeply. Reflect, but not too long. Emotional restraint was framed as health. Emotional intensity became pathology. In this way, medieval psychology trained people not to ask what they felt, but whether they were feeling too much. The safest emotional state was mild discomfort, paired with acceptance. Contentment was tolerated. Joy was suspicious. Despair was unacceptable unless quickly treated. Balance was everything, even if that balance required pain. And yet, despite everything, people continued to feel. They felt grief. They felt fear. They felt love. They felt exhaustion. The humors never fully explained it, but they provided language. They provided ritual. They provided a way to talk about suffering without confronting its cause. And for centuries, that was enough. As we drift deeper into this story, it becomes clear that medieval psychology was not trying to erase emotion. It was trying to contain it, to make it predictable, to make it obedient, to make it fit inside a system that promised order in a disorderly world. Sadness in this system was not tragic. It was inconvenient. And inconvenience, unlike grief, can always be drained away. Or at least that was the hope. Once emotions were reduced to fluids, medieval psychology turned its suspicion toward the mind itself. Because too much thinking, it decided, was not insight but strain. In medieval psychology, the mind was not a tool for understanding. It was a surface that wore down when used too often. Once sadness had been successfully transformed into a liquid problem, medieval psychology faced an obvious follow-up question. If emotions were caused by fluids misbehaving inside the body, then what exactly made those fluids misbehave in the first place? The answer arrived quietly, confidently, and with lasting consequences. Thinking. Too much thinking. Thinking that lingered. Thinking that turned inward. Thinking that refused to stop. The medieval brain, according to scholars of the time, was not sturdy. It was not resilient. It was soft, damp, and dangerously sensitive. More sponge than engine, more clay than muscle. This was not an insult, it was a technical description. The brain, they believed, existed in a delicate balance of moisture and warmth, and that balance could be easily disturbed. Heat dried it out. Cold made it sluggish. Excess activity exhausted it, and nothing strained the brain quite like sustained thought. Thinking generated heat. Heat agitated the humors. Agitated humors produced bile, and bile, as we have already seen, caused sadness, melancholy, and eventual collapse. The logic was clean, elegant even. You were not overwhelmed because life was difficult. You were overwhelmed because you had thought about it for too long. In this framework, reflection was not a virtue. It was a liability. Medieval psychology did not separate thinking from physical exertion. The mind was not imagined as a separate realm of abstract processes. It was a physical organ doing physical work, and like any organ, it could be overworked. Too much reading, too much studying, too much staring into the distance with that particular expression. All of it counted as strain, and strained organs failed. This belief carried a warning embedded inside it. Use your mind only as much as necessary. Think enough to perform your duties. Say your prayers. Follow instructions. Do not ask follow-up questions. Curiosity was tolerated briefly, but it was watched closely, the way one watches a child near open water. Scholars were especially at risk. The medieval world admired scholars in theory. Learning was respected. Knowledge was praised. But admiration came with suspicion. A scholar who spent too much time reading, writing, or debating was not seen as dedicated. He was seen as tempting fate. Late nights bent over manuscripts were thought to dry the brain. Prolonged concentration overheated the mind. Excess study drained vital spirits. Madness waited patiently at the end of every paragraph. Philosophers suffered the worst reputation of all. A philosopher who asked too many questions was not brave. He was reckless. A man who stared into space for long periods was assumed to be mentally rearranging himself in dangerous ways. If he withdrew socially, that was not depth. It was deterioration. Medieval society liked philosophy as a concept. It distrusted philosophers as people. Creativity only made things worse. Imagination stirred internal motion. It animated thoughts that did not need to exist. Poetry, art, speculation, metaphor. These were not harmless expressions. They activated the wrong parts of the mind. They warmed the brain. They disturbed the humors. Creative individuals were tolerated only in moderation, and preferably when their output could be controlled. A little imagination for religious imagery was acceptable. Too much imagination for personal reflection was not. In medieval psychology, creativity was a medical risk factor. This explains a great deal about how thinking was managed. Students were advised to take frequent breaks from study, not short breaks, long ones, ideally permanent. Overexertion of the mind was believed to invite melancholy, madness, and spiritual imbalance. A mind that worked too hard began to fold in on itself. Silence followed. Withdrawal followed. Then came the diagnosis. Once again, the response was not understanding. It was regulation. Thinking too much was not framed as a response to uncertainty, fear, or curiosity. It was framed as excess. And excess, in medieval psychology, always demanded correction. If sadness could be drained, then thought could be limited. If imagination caused imbalance, then stimulation could be reduced. The solution to mental strain was not rest in the modern sense. It was avoidance. Do not think too deeply. Do not dwell. Do not analyze. Do not rehearse. Do not reflect. This belief did not eliminate thought. It redirected it. Thinking was allowed when it served authority. Theology was permitted because it reinforced structure. Memorization was encouraged because it did not invite interpretation. Repetition was safe. Questioning was not. The safest mental activity was one that did not generate new ideas. Women, of course, were considered especially vulnerable. Medieval psychology taught that women's brains were naturally colder and wetter. This meant they were more emotionally reactive and less stable under mental strain. Serious intellectual activity was not merely inappropriate, it was dangerous to their health. Education was discouraged not only by ideology but by medicine. To teach a woman to think deeply was to risk overheating an already damp mind. This was framed as protection. We are not limiting you, medieval texts implied. We are preserving your balance. Strong emotions were dangerous, strong thoughts even more so. Supervision, moderation, and restraint were presented as care. And in a system that equated health with obedience, this logic felt compassionate. Even dreams were implicated. A mind that did not fully rest during sleep was suspect. Vivid dreams suggested that imagination was still active. The brain had failed to shut down properly. This meant imbalance. Dreams were not seen as harmless byproducts of the mind at rest. They were evidence. Evidence that thinking had gone too far, too deep, too late. The ideal mental state, according to medieval psychology, was mild awareness paired with compliance, alert enough to function, quiet enough to remain stable. Anything beyond that risked disorder. There is something almost tender about this fear of thinking. Medieval society understood, on some level, that the mind was powerful. It could disrupt routines, challenge beliefs, unsettle hierarchies. Thinking created movement, movement threatened order. By framing thought as a health hazard, medieval psychology found a way to discourage it without admitting why. After all, if thinking makes you sick, then obedience becomes medicine. This belief system did not produce a society without thought. It produced a society where thought was carefully rationed, where silence was praised, where certainty was valued more than curiosity, where people learned to monitor their own minds, checking constantly for signs of excess. And yet, despite all of this, people continued to think. They thought at night, they thought quietly, they thought while working, they thought in ways that could not be drained, cooled, or restrained. Medieval psychology could warn against thinking, but it could not stop it. It could only shape how people felt about it. thinking became dangerous not because it harmed the brain, but because it invited questions the system could not answer. So medieval psychology did what it always did best. It offered certainty instead. And certainty, delivered calmly and confidently, was far easier to live with than the unsettling freedom of thought. In the medieval world, the greatest risk was not ignorance. It was thinking long enough to notice it. After thought became dangerous, anger could no longer be a reaction. It had to be heat, rising too quickly inside a body that failed to stay cool. In medieval psychology, rage was not a reaction to the world. It was an overheating appliance inside your body. Once thinking had been labeled a health hazard, medieval psychology turned its attention to another disruptive force that refused to remain quiet. Anger. Loud, visible, inconvenient anger. The kind that raised voices, clenched fists, and unsettled rooms. Modern minds might see anger as a response to injustice, frustration, or threat. Medieval thinkers saw something far more practical. They saw a furnace problem. Anger, according to medieval theory, did not originate in the mind. It rose from the liver. Specifically, it came from yellow bile, a hot, dry substance believed to be produced by the liver and distributed throughout the body. When yellow bile behaved itself, a person was calm, decisive, and appropriately assertive. When it did not, when it overheated or accumulated excessively, it produced rage, sharp words, impatience, violence. The emotion itself was not the issue. The temperature was. In this worldview, emotional regulation had very little to do with self-control. It was about climate management. If you were angry, you were not responding to circumstances. You were malfunctioning internally. Your organs were too warm. Your fluids were too dry. Your liver, quite frankly, was misbehaving. This explanation had a certain appeal. It removed blame from the world and placed it squarely inside the body. You were not reacting to mistreatment, inequality, or stress. You were experiencing a heat imbalance. And once anger became a heat problem, the solution was obvious. Cool it down. Medieval medicine approached rage with the same confidence it applied to sadness and thought. Cooling diets were prescribed. Cold baths were encouraged. Spicy foods were forbidden. Alcohol was discouraged. Sexual activity was restricted. Excitement of any kind was frowned upon. In short, anything that made life tolerable was removed in the name of balance. Bloodletting, naturally, made another appearance. If your blood was running too hot, removing some of it seemed sensible. Less blood meant less heat. Less heat meant calmer bile. Calmer bile meant fewer outbursts. Medieval psychology was nothing if not consistent. The body was a system of fluids and temperatures, and anger was simply one more indicator that something inside had warmed beyond acceptable limits. This explanation shaped behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Angry people were not encouraged to reflect on what had provoked them. They were encouraged to sit quietly, to cool down, to avoid stimulation, to reduce their inner temperature. Disagreement was not framed as conflict. It was framed as imbalance. A heated argument was not a clash of ideas. It was a sign that someone's liver needed attention. Accountability in this system was optional. Cooling was mandatory. This framework also did something particularly useful for medieval society. It explained violence without challenging authority. Men, according to medieval theory, were naturally hotter than women. Their bodies ran warm. Their blood moved quickly. Their bile was more active. This explained why men were more prone to anger, aggression, and physical force. It also excused it. Male violence was reframed as a natural byproduct of biological heat, rather than a moral or social problem. A man who struck out in anger was not necessarily cruel or unjust. He was warm-blooded. His organs were doing what organs do. This did not mean violence was celebrated, but it was understood, tolerated, managed, rather than questioned. Women, on the other hand, were believed to be colder and wetter. Their bodies were thought to lack the natural heat required for sustained anger. This conveniently explained why women were expected to be calm, passive, and emotionally contained. When women did express anger, it was not interpreted as righteous or justified. It was labeled hysteria, a separate problem involving moisture, imbalance, and prayer. In other words, men were angry because they were hot. Women were angry because they were wrong. Medieval psychology was very proud of how neatly this explained everything. Even righteous anger was discouraged. Excess passion of any kind was dangerous. A man who shouted too much was not standing up for himself. He was unbalanced. A woman who raised her voice at all was suspected of deeper instability. Emotional restraint became a marker of health. Composure signaled balance. Silence signaled control. In legal and social contexts, this mattered. Anger could be treated as evidence of poor health rather than poor judgment. A person who lashed out might not be punished as severely if their behavior was attributed to internal heat. Conversely, someone who remained visibly angry for too long was seen as failing to manage their condition. The solution was never justice, it was cooling. Medieval psychology did not ask whether anger might be a reasonable response to hunger, danger, or oppression. That question would have required examining the world itself. Instead, it examined livers, it examined diets, it examined bodily fluids, and in doing so, it turned social problems into medical ones. This was not accidental. By locating anger inside the body, medieval psychology removed the need to address its causes. Anger became an individual defect rather than a collective signal. If people were angry, it was not because something was wrong with society. It was because their humors were acting up. The solution was not reform. It was restraint. And restraint was something medieval society valued deeply. There is a quiet irony here. Anger, when understood properly, can be informative. It highlights boundaries. It signals harm. It motivates change. Medieval psychology sensed its power and decided it was safer to neutralize it, to cool it, to drain it, to reduce it to a manageable temperature. So anger was treated like a fever. If it spiked, it had to be brought down. If it lingered, it had to be suppressed. If it erupted, it had to be explained away. The goal was never to understand what anger pointed toward. The goal was to make it stop making noise. And yet, just as with sadness and thought, anger refused to disappear. People continued to feel it, quietly, loudly, inappropriate moments, appropriate ones. Medieval psychology could explain anger endlessly, but it could not prevent it. It could only reshape how people were allowed to express it and who was permitted to do so without consequence. The system worked because it aligned with power. Those who held authority were rarely required to cool themselves. Those beneath them were constantly reminded to do so. Emotional control became a virtue when it preserved hierarchy, and a defect when it challenged it. In this way, anger became not just a medical issue, but a political one. And medieval psychology, with its talk of bile and temperature and unruly organs, provided exactly the language needed to keep that politics comfortably hidden. If you were angry, the problem was not injustice. It was not exploitation. It was not the world pressing too hard against you. It was your liver. And once anger could be blamed on an organ, it could be managed without ever changing the conditions that produced it. And when even anger could be cooled, medieval psychology faced something far more unsettling. Love, a force so disruptive it had to be treated as illness. In medieval psychology, love was not a mystery of the heart. It was a medical emergency that needed supervision. After medieval psychology finished cooling anger and blaming overheated organs, it turned its careful, suspicious attention towards something even more disruptive. Love. Not the polite, orderly kind that fit neatly into marriage contracts and inheritance laws, but the unruly version, the kind that arrived uninvited, the kind that interfered with sleep, appetite, and productivity, the kind that made people stare into space and forget what they were supposed to be doing. This was not romantic. It was pathological. Medieval thinkers did not ask whether love was meaningful, transformative, or deeply human. They asked whether it was stable, and by their standards, it was not. Love caused visible symptoms: paleness, insomnia, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts, excessive sighing, sudden poetry, an alarming tendency to wander mentally, while the body remained inconveniently present. These were not signs of devotion. They were warning signs. Love, in medieval psychology, was a sickness. The condition was often referred to as love sickness, and it was taken very seriously. Falling in love was believed to disrupt the balance of the humors, overheating the heart and drying the brain. Vital spirits raced through the body without supervision, like children running through a monastery corridor. Order was lost. Fluids misbehaved. Balance collapsed. Something had to be done. Once again, the logic was consistent. If sadness could be drained and anger cooled, then love could be treated as a fever. And fevers, by definition, needed to be brought down. The treatments were predictable. Cold baths were popular because medieval medicine firmly believed that romance could be rinsed away. Bloodletting made another appearance because if love made your thoughts race, clearly you had too much blood. Diets were adjusted, spices were removed, wine was restricted, stimulation of any kind was discouraged, and above all, the patient was instructed to avoid the object of affection. Exposure therapy was not part of the plan. Seeing the person you loved was believed to worsen the condition. Proximity fed the imagination. Imagination overheated the brain. Overheated brains produced imbalance. Therefore, separation was medicine. Distance was healing. Absence was prescribed. If the lovesick person was a peasant who stopped working, the concern was practical. Fields did not plow themselves. If someone neglected their labor because they were thinking about another person's eyes, this was not charming. It was dangerous. Love interfered with productivity, and medieval society did not appreciate inefficiency disguised as emotion. In more severe cases, marriage was recommended, not as a celebration of love, but as containment. Marriage, in this framework, was not the culmination of romance. It was a stabilizing procedure, a way to regulate desire by assigning it a legal structure and a schedule. Passion outside marriage was feverish and uncontrolled. Passion within marriage was acceptable because it was predictable. Love, once formalized, could be monitored. Duties replaced longing. Routine replaced obsession. The sickness, ideally, resolved itself. If marriage was not possible, distraction was prescribed. Travel, prayer, physical labor, anything that exhausted the body enough to quiet the mind. Love, medieval psychology believed, thrived in idleness. Work cooled it. Fatigue subdued it. Silence eventually suffocated it. Feelings were not explored. They were redirected. The gendered nature of this diagnosis was difficult to ignore. Men diagnosed with love sickness were often treated as temporarily foolish, distracted, a little unwell. Women, however, were more likely to be labeled unstable. Their emotions were seen as excessive, their attachment as dangerous. Female desire was especially threatening because it resisted control more visibly. Once again, psychology aligned neatly with social expectations. Love was tolerated only when it behaved itself. Controlled affection within marriage was acceptable. Longing, obsession, passion, and desire were viewed with suspicion. Love was allowed in small, regulated doses, like a dangerous medicine. Enough to fulfill obligations, not enough to disrupt order. There is a quiet sadness in this approach. Medieval psychology recognized that love had power. It changed behavior. It altered priorities. It made people irrational. And instead of asking what that power meant, it treated it as a threat, something to be managed rather than understood. But there is also a strange tenderness buried inside it. In a world where disease, famine, and violence could erase joy without warning, love was risky. To love deeply was to attach oneself to something that could be taken away. Medieval society understood this instinctively. Distrusting love was, in a way, a survival strategy. If you never let yourself feel too much, you never had to lose too much. So, love was framed as an illness, not because it was weak, but because it was strong. Modern psychology tends to see love as attachment, chemistry, and connection. Medieval psychology saw it as imbalance, a fever of the heart, a dryness of the brain, a disturbance of vital spirits. And like all medieval fevers, the solution was to drain something until the symptoms stopped moving. And yet, despite cold baths and bloodletting, despite separation and supervision, people continued to fall in love. They wrote poems anyway. They stared into space anyway. They lost sleep anyway. Medieval psychology could name the symptoms. It could prescribe treatments. It could explain love endlessly. What it could not do was make love reasonable. That may be why it feared it so deeply. Love did not obey balance. It did not respect moderation. It did not respond predictably to rules. It blurred boundaries between body and mind, duty and desire. In a system built on control, love was an anomaly. So it was diagnosed. Not to cure it completely, but to keep it from spreading too freely. As we move forward, this pattern becomes familiar. Sadness was drained. Thought was restricted. Anger was cooled. Love was contained. Each emotion, once identified as disruptive, was transformed into a condition. And each condition justified a response that preserved order, even if it misunderstood the human experience entirely. Love, in medieval psychology, was never allowed to be wild. And perhaps that tells us more about medieval fear than medieval medicine ever could. With emotions mapped and controlled, the system searched for a final explanation, and found it not in feelings, but in gender. When medieval psychology ran out of explanations, it discovered that gender was the most convenient diagnosis of all. By the time medieval psychology finished diagnosing sadness, restricting thought, cooling anger, and containing love, it had built a system that appeared complete. Every emotion had a fluid. Every disruption had a temperature. Every excess had a remedy. All that remained was to explain why some people seemed more emotionally unstable than others. The answer arrived with remarkable speed and very little resistance. Women. According to medieval thinkers, women were not merely different from men, they were composed differently. Their bodies were believed to be colder, wetter, and more fluid. Moisture, in medieval science, was not a neutral quality. It implied instability. Liquids moved, they slipped, they resisted form. Dryness, by contrast, represented firmness, clarity, and control. Heat gave energy. Dryness gave structure. Together, these qualities define the ideal human temperament. Conveniently, men were described as naturally hot and dry. Women, on the other hand, were cold and moist. Psychologically soggy, one might say. Their emotions were thought to flow too easily. Their thoughts failed to set properly. Reason, like damp bread, refused to harden. This was not presented as insult. It was framed as science, objective, observational, inevitable. And once this belief took hold, it explained everything medieval society already wanted to believe. If women expressed emotion, it was not because they were responding to constraint, danger, exhaustion, or lack of agency. It was because their internal balance was unstable. If women cried, it was moisture escaping. If they became angry, their fluids had shifted incorrectly. If they thought too deeply, they risked drying out the wrong parts of the brain. A dangerous prospect for a mind already considered structurally unsound. In this framework, women were not discouraged from education because of ideology alone. They were discouraged for their own health. Serious intellectual activity was believed to be risky. Studying required sustained thought. Thought generated heat. Heat dried the brain. A dried brain in a moist body was a recipe for imbalance. Teaching women to think deeply was framed not as empowerment, but as endangerment. Medieval psychology did not say women should not think. It said women should be protected from thinking too much. Restriction was recast as care. Medical texts warned that women required supervision, moderation, and external guidance to maintain balance. Emotional restraint was not encouraged as growth, but enforced as safety. Strong feelings were not signs of passion or conviction. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a system too fluid to manage itself. And so psychology became policy. A woman who spoke forcefully was not persuasive. She was unstable. A woman who questioned authority was not curious. She was imbalanced. A woman who resisted her assigned role was not dissatisfied. She was unhealthy. Her mind, it was assumed, had become too wet, too cold, too disordered to function properly. This belief did not emerge in isolation. It was reinforced by interpretations of the female body itself: menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth. These processes were seen as evidence that women were governed by fluids: constant movement, constant leakage, constant change. To medieval thinkers, this confirmed what psychology already suggested. Women were closer to nature, closer to chaos, and therefore required control. Psychology offered the justification. Society provided the structure. Emotional expression in women was not explored. It was contained. Emotional regulation was not taught. Emotional suppression was praised. Silence became a virtue. Compliance became health. The ideal woman, psychologically speaking, was calm, obedient, and quiet. Not because she felt less, but because feeling too much was considered dangerous. There is a quiet cruelty in how neatly this system aligned. A woman's fear was not seen as awareness of danger. It was weakness. A woman's anger was not a response to injustice. It was hysteria. A woman's sadness was not grief. It was excess moisture. At no point did medieval psychology seriously entertain the idea that women might be emotional because their lives were constrained, physically demanding, and relentlessly precarious. That idea would have required reflection. And reflection, as we've already seen, was risky. This gendered psychology did more than explain behavior. It enforced hierarchy. If men were naturally suited to reason, authority, and public life, then their dominance was justified. If women were naturally unstable, then their exclusion was protective rather than oppressive. Power did not need to be defended. It could be prescribed. Psychology, in this sense, became a technology of control. The brilliance of the system lay in its subtlety. Women were not told they were inferior. They were told they were delicate. They were not denied opportunity. They were shielded from harm. Limitation was framed as compassion. Surveillance became support. Obedience became health. And because the explanation was medical, resistance could be dismissed as further evidence of imbalance. A woman who protested her treatment was emotional. A woman who demanded education was reckless. A woman who sought independence was endangering herself. Every attempt to step outside the prescribed role confirmed the diagnosis. The system could not be challenged from within because the challenge itself was treated as pathology. This logic extended beyond women, but women bore its weight most consistently. Children, the poor, and the socially marginal were also described as unstable, undeveloped, or insufficiently dry. But women occupied a unique position. Their bodies ensured that the explanation could always be refreshed. Biology provided endless confirmation. There is a bitter irony here. Medieval psychology claimed to fear emotional excess, yet it was deeply invested in maintaining emotional inequality. Men were allowed anger because it aligned with authority. Women were denied it because it threatened order. Psychology did not eliminate emotion. It redistributed permission. And yet, despite centuries of diagnosis, women continued to think. They learned quietly. They reasoned privately. They felt deeply. They navigated a world that treated their inner lives as medical hazards and still managed to function. Medieval psychology could describe women endlessly, but it never truly understood them. Understanding was never the goal. The goal was stability. By the time medieval psychology finished mapping emotions onto gender, it had completed a circle. Sadness became liquid. Thought became dangerous. Anger became heat. Love became illness. And women became the embodiment of everything that needed regulation. Emotion flowed into gender. Gender flowed into power. And power, once justified by psychology, no longer needed to explain itself. This is the quiet lesson of medieval gendered psychology. It did not invent inequality. It explained it. It gave it language. It wrapped it in care and called it science. And in doing so, it ensured that control could feel natural, inevitable, and even kind, which may be the most unsettling diagnosis of all. When waking thoughts were finally restrained, medieval psychology followed the mind into sleep and discovered that even rest could misbehave. In medieval psychology, sleep was never innocent. Even the mind at rest could be caught misbehaving. Once medieval psychology had finished explaining emotions, gender, and power, it turned its attention to the one place people were supposed to be safe from scrutiny: sleep. Or more precisely, the things that happened when the body was still, but the mind refused to stay quiet. Dreams were not considered harmless, they were not private, and they were certainly not meaningless. In the medieval imagination, a dream was a message, not a random one, not a fragmented echo of daily life, but a signal that something inside you was active when it should not have been. Sleep was meant to be passive, restful, blank. A proper night's sleep involved the body shutting down and the mind obediently following along. When that did not happen, when images appeared, narratives unfolded, or emotions surfaced, medieval psychology grew suspicious. Why was your mind still working? The answer, once again, was imbalance. Dreams were believed to form when internal vapors rose upward during sleep. These vapors, produced by digestion, emotion, and bodily fluids, drifted into the brain and disturbed it. If the vapors were heavy, dreams were dark. If they were light, dreams were pleasant. If they were chaotic, the person was unwell. The quality of your dreams revealed the state of your inner system. This meant that even unconscious experiences were diagnostic. A peaceful dream was not necessarily reassuring. It raised questions. Why was the mind so relaxed? What had failed to register during waking hours? Nightmares, however, were extremely useful. They could indicate internal disturbance, unresolved imbalance, or excessive thought. A frightening dream meant something inside you was out of alignment. And alignment, as medieval psychology insisted, was your responsibility. Dream interpretation manuals became popular for this very reason. They provided certainty. Symbols were cataloged. Falling meant weakness. Fire meant agitation. Teeth falling out meant impending trouble. It was rarely good. Dreams were almost never neutral. Medieval psychology did not believe in neutral mental experiences. If something appeared in your mind, it meant something had gone wrong. This approach had a subtle effect. It erased the boundary between intention and experience. A person could be held accountable for thoughts they did not choose. If you dreamed vividly, it suggested a lack of discipline. If you dreamed obsessively, it implied excess imagination. If you dreamed of things considered inappropriate, it indicated internal disorder. The fact that you were unconscious at the time was irrelevant. The mind, medieval psychology believed, never truly rested, and if it misbehaved at night, it revealed what it had been planning all along. This created a strange kind of guilt, one that operated independently of action. You could lie still, breathe evenly, do nothing at all, and still wake up at fault. Dreams turned the sleeping mind into a potential crime scene. Evidence appeared without witnesses. Intent was assumed. Explanation was demanded. People learned to be wary of their own nights. Even pleasant dreams carried risk. Excessively joyful dreams suggested a mind that was too relaxed, too comfortable. A lack of internal tension was not always celebrated. Balance required vigilance. Too much calm could be just as suspicious as too much fear. The safest dreams were forgettable ones. Dreams that left no trace. Dreams that did not insist on being remembered. Memory itself became dangerous. To remember a dream clearly meant it had made an impression. Impressions lingered. Lingering suggested imbalance. People were encouraged to report their dreams, analyze them, and correct whatever they were thought to reveal. Sleep was no longer a refuge. It was a continuation of self-monitoring. This fit neatly into the broader system. If sadness was excess fluid, dreams revealed where it was pooling. If thought was dangerous, dreams exposed when thinking had gone too far. If emotions were meant to be regulated, dreams showed what escaped regulation. Sleep became another space where order had to be maintained. And yet there was an unspoken fear beneath all of this. Dreams were unpredictable. They resisted structure. They ignored instruction. They blurred the line between imagination and sensation. Medieval psychology sensed this and reacted accordingly. It classified, labeled, and interpreted dreams until they could be made legible. If dreams could be decoded, they could be controlled. If they could be controlled, they could no longer threaten stability. So people learned to watch themselves even while asleep. A restless night was not just uncomfortable, it was informative. A nightmare was not just frightening, it was revealing. A recurring dream suggested stubborn imbalance. The solution was not reassurance, it was correction. Adjust the diet, reduce stimulation. Avoid strong emotions. Think less during the day so the mind would behave at night. Once again, the response was regulation, not understanding. There is something quietly unsettling about this approach. Medieval psychology understood that the mind did not simply turn off. It knew that thoughts continued beneath the surface. Instead of exploring what that meant, it treated it as a problem to be solved. Dreams were not invitations to insight. They were warnings. And warnings demanded action. In this system, the ideal sleeper was invisible. No dreams, no movement, no disturbance. A person who slept too deeply without dreams was considered well-regulated. A person who dreamed vividly was flagged for observation. Sleep was not about restoration. It was about compliance. This had consequences. People began to distrust their own inner worlds. The mind became something to suppress rather than explore. Nighttime, instead of offering release, became another stage for discipline. Even rest carried expectations. Even unconsciousness required supervision. And yet, dreams persisted. No matter how carefully diets were managed, no matter how strictly stimulation was reduced, no matter how much people tried to think less, dreams continued to appear. Images surfaced, narratives unfolded, emotions moved freely in a space beyond control. Medieval psychology could explain dreams endlessly, but it could not prevent them. So it did the next best thing. It taught people to fear them. Dreams became evidence of internal instability. Nightmares became signs of failure, and the sleeping mind became one more place where responsibility could be assigned. If something went wrong during the day, the night was consulted. If the night misbehaved, the day was corrected. This circular logic was powerful. It left no escape. Waking life was monitored. Emotional life was regulated. And even sleep, the final refuge, was absorbed into the system. In the medieval world, you did not stop being accountable when you closed your eyes. And perhaps that is the quietest cruelty of all. Because a mind that cannot rest without judgment eventually learns to stay quiet even when it has something to say. And when no balance could be restored, the system reached its most decisive conclusion. The mind had not fallen ill, it had failed. When medieval psychology encountered a mind it could not organize, it decided the mind had failed rather than the system. By the time medieval psychology finished monitoring dreams and assigning meaning to the unconscious, it had quietly erased the last safe space a person might have claimed. If even sleep could be evaluated, interpreted, and corrected, then there was nowhere left for distress to exist without explanation. And when people began to struggle in ways that no amount of draining, cooling, or regulating could resolve, medieval psychology reached its most decisive conclusion. There was no such thing as mental health. There was only alignment. A well-functioning person was someone whose inner state matched the expectations placed upon them. Calm, obedient, predictable, productive. When a person drifted outside those boundaries, when they withdrew, heard things others did not, behaved erratically, or became overwhelmed by fear, medieval psychology did not ask what they were experiencing. It asked what they had failed to maintain. Distress was not treated as a condition, it was treated as deviation. In this framework, the mind was not something that could become ill, it could only become incorrect. Thoughts that moved too fast or too slowly were not symptoms, they were errors. Emotions that overwhelmed a person were not signals, they were lapses. Confusion was not disorientation, it was misalignment. This distinction mattered deeply because it determined responsibility. If suffering was a condition, then care might be required. If suffering was deviation, then correction was sufficient. Medieval psychology chose correction, and correction, by definition, belonged to the person being corrected. Responsibility always flowed downward. When someone behaved unpredictably, the response was not curiosity. It was discipline. The assumption was simple. If the mind had wandered, it needed to be brought back. If it resisted, it needed to be restrained. If it collapsed, it needed to be isolated until order could be restored. Care was not absent from this system. It was simply redefined. Isolation was considered helpful. Quiet environments were believed to calm excessive internal motion. Separation from daily life reduced stimulation. Restriction was framed as protection. A person overwhelmed by their own thoughts was not abandoned. They were removed for their own good and for the stability of those around them. Silence, once again, was medicine. Talking about distress was not encouraged. Speech stirred thoughts. Thoughts created movement. Movement threatened balance. A person in visible distress was advised to speak less, not more, to withdraw, to comply, to allow the system to correct them. This approach had a reassuring clarity to it. If someone improved, the correction had worked. If they did not, the problem was not the method, it was the person. Perhaps they were resisting. Perhaps they were stubborn. Perhaps their imbalance was severe. The explanation always pointed inward. The system remained intact. There was also a hierarchy of acceptable distress. A scholar who became withdrawn or melancholic might be described as sensitive or overburdened. Their struggle could be tolerated, even romanticized. A noble who behaved erratically might be labeled eccentric, unusual, but interesting. A poor person exhibiting the same behavior, however, was dangerous. Their distress was not aesthetic, it was disruptive. Medieval psychology adapted smoothly to social class. Those with status were granted complexity. Those without were granted correction. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was order maintenance. Medieval society believed that stability required boundaries, and boundaries required enforcement. A person whose mind did not conform threatened predictability, and predictability was the foundation of safety. Understanding was not the goal. Containment was. There is something quietly logical about this approach when viewed from within its world. Resources were limited, explanations were scarce, fear was constant. A system that located responsibility within the individual allowed society to function without confronting problems it could not solve. If distress belonged to the person, society could remain unchanged. This belief had consequences that extended far beyond treatment. It shaped how people understood themselves. Struggling internally became a source of shame. Difficulty coping was interpreted as weakness. Asking for help risked exposure. Better to endure quietly than to be marked as misaligned. People learned to hide. They learned to suppress symptoms, to perform stability, to appear calm even when they were not. Medieval psychology rewarded those who could contain their suffering and punished those who could not. Over time, this created a culture where visible distress was more dangerous than distress itself. And yet, despite all of this, people continued to break. Minds fractured, fear overwhelmed, confusion lingered. Medieval psychology could describe these states endlessly, but it could not prevent them. It could only assign meaning after the fact. And the meaning it assigned was always the same. You are responsible for this. This belief was powerful because it offered certainty. In a world where so much was uncontrollable, assigning blame created order. It reduced randomness. It made suffering feel purposeful. If distress was the result of failure, then success was theoretically attainable. Balance could be restored through effort, discipline, and compliance. Whether or not this was true mattered less than the comfort it provided. There is a strange tenderness in the way medieval psychology tried to make sense of mental collapse. It wanted the world to be fair. It wanted causes to match outcomes. It wanted effort to matter. By framing distress as moral deviation rather than illness, it preserved the illusion that the system itself was sound. The alternative, that suffering could occur without reason, without fault, without solution, was far more unsettling. So medieval psychology chose a narrative that made sense, a narrative where order was possible, where correction was meaningful, where responsibility could be assigned. But in doing so, it placed the full weight of distress onto those least able to carry it. The person who struggled was not supported. They were scrutinized. Their pain became evidence. Their behavior became testimony. Their recovery, if it came, validated the system. Their collapse, if it persisted, condemned them. This was not a psychology of care. It was a psychology of control, and yet it endured. Not because it was accurate, but because it was complete. It left no loose ends, no unanswered questions, no uncomfortable gaps where uncertainty might enter. Everything had an explanation. And when a system explains everything, it rarely feels the need to explain itself. This is the quiet legacy of medieval thinking about mental distress. It did not lack intelligence, it lacked humility. It assumed that if something could not be understood, it must be corrected. And if correction failed, the failure belonged to the person, not the idea. As we move forward, this pattern becomes increasingly familiar. Fear will be explained, joy will be limited, silence will be praised, and responsibility will continue to flow in only one direction. Because in medieval psychology, the greatest threat was not suffering. It was a mind that refused to behave. From failure, medieval psychology turned to fear and decided it was not a warning, but blood retreating when it should have advanced. In medieval psychology, fear was not a warning from the mind. It was a circulation problem that needed warming up. After medieval psychology finished deciding that distress was a personal failure rather than a condition, it turned to fear and reached a conclusion that felt satisfyingly mechanical. Fear, it claimed, was not an emotion. It was not information. It was not the body responding intelligently to danger. Fear was what happened when blood lost its confidence. According to medieval thinkers, courage depended on warm, fast-moving blood. Blood that flowed outward, boldly, energetically, toward the limbs and face. A courageous person was hot-blooded in the most literal sense. Their circulation was strong, their inner heat steady. Their vital forces moved forward instead of retreating. Fear, by contrast, was cold blood. When someone became afraid, medieval psychology believed their blood slowed, cooled, and withdrew inward. The heart shrank, the limbs trembled, the face paled. These visible signs were not interpreted as responses to threat. They were taken as evidence that the blood had abandoned its post. Fear was not caution. It was failure of circulation. This explanation had a certain blunt elegance. You were not afraid because something was dangerous. You were afraid because your blood had lost momentum. And once fear became a circulation issue, the treatment was obvious. Do not reassure the frightened person. Reassurance does nothing for cold blood. Instead, warm the body, increase heat, stimulate circulation. Hot foods were recommended. Wine, spices, and rich meals were encouraged. Physical exertion helped. So did loud encouragement, sharp commands, and occasionally yelling. Fear was not soothed. It was corrected. Medieval psychology did not ask what someone was afraid of. It asked how cold they were. This belief shaped how fear was understood socially. A fearful person was not cautious. They were weak. Their blood lacked vigor. Their inner heat had faded. Courage was framed as a bodily quality rather than a choice. You either had warm blood or you did not. Once again, this explanation aligned neatly with hierarchy. Men were believed to be naturally warmer than women. Their blood moved faster. Their circulation was stronger. This conveniently explained why men were expected to be brave and women were expected to be fearful. Fear in women was not surprising. It was expected. Fear in men was embarrassing. Children were also considered prone to fear because their bodies were still forming. Their heat had not fully developed. Older people were fearful because their heat was fading. In every case, fear was framed as physical decline rather than emotional intelligence. Fear was never treated as information. This mattered most in moments of real danger. In a world shaped by disease, violence, and uncertainty, fear was often the body's most accurate response. Fear kept people alive. It encouraged caution. It prevented reckless exposure. It signaled when something was wrong. Medieval psychology did not deny that fear existed. It simply refused to grant it legitimacy. To acknowledge fear as useful would have required admitting that panic in a collapsing environment might be reasonable. It would have suggested that the world itself was unsafe, not merely the individual. Medieval psychology avoided that conclusion carefully. Instead, it located fear entirely within the body. If someone panicked, they were defective. If a soldier fled, his blood was weak. If a person hesitated, their circulation needed improvement. Fear was never framed as a survival instinct. It was framed as a personal inadequacy with biological implications. The treatments reflected this attitude. Warm baths, heavy blankets, hot meals, physical labor, anything that increased heat and movement was encouraged. Stillness was discouraged, quiet reflection was dangerous. Fear thrived in inactivity. Movement chased it away. Or so the theory went. There is something almost tragic in this misunderstanding. Medieval psychology correctly observed the physical sensations of fear, cold skin, trembling limbs, racing heart, but misread their meaning entirely. Instead of seeing the body preparing for action, it saw the body failing to perform. And yet the system persisted because it offered clarity. Fear could now be measured. It had signs, it had causes, it had remedies. No one had to ask whether fear made sense. They only had to ask whether blood was flowing properly. This belief also shaped expectations around courage. Courage was not framed as acting despite fear. That idea would have implied that fear could coexist with strength. Medieval psychology rejected that possibility. Courage meant absence of fear. A courageous person did not feel afraid because their blood remained hot and active. Any visible fear was proof that courage had failed. This created an impossible standard. People were expected not only to act bravely, but to feel bravely, to suppress fear entirely, to deny its presence. And when fear inevitably appeared, it was hidden, masked, or explained away. Over time, fear became something to be ashamed of. People learned to ignore it, to push past it, to interpret it as weakness rather than warning. Medieval psychology rewarded those who could override fear and punished those who could not. In doing so, it reinforced the idea that safety came from obedience and endurance rather than awareness. And yet, fear continued to do its work quietly. It guided people away from danger even when they refused to name it. It shaped behavior in ways medieval theory could not fully account for. People avoided places, situations, and risks despite being told their fear was invalid. The body remembered what the system denied. This tension never resolved. Medieval psychology could explain fear endlessly, but it could not eliminate it. It could only insist that fear was wrong, cold blood, weak circulation, something to be fixed rather than understood. In this way, fear joined sadness, thought, anger, love, dreams, and distress in the same category, not as messages from the human experience, but as malfunctions within a system that demanded order above all else. Fear was not respected. It was managed. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. Because a society that refuses to listen to fear is rarely fearless. It is simply practiced at ignoring the signals that might have kept it alive. In medieval psychology, courage was praised, fear was corrected, and the quiet intelligence of survival was left unnamed. The blood, they believed, only needed warming. The danger, it turned out, was never part of the diagnosis. Eventually, the body grew inconvenient to blame, so responsibility was gently lifted upward toward the sky. When medieval psychology grew tired of blaming the body, it outsourced responsibility to the sky. After medieval psychology had blamed sadness on fluids, thought on heat, anger on organs, fear on blood, and distress on personal failure, it arrived at a realization both elegant and deeply relieving. Some things were simply too complicated to fix from the inside, so the explanation had to come from somewhere else, far away, high above, completely unreachable, the stars. In medieval psychology, personality was not fully yours. It was assigned. At the moment of your birth, the positions of the planets impressed themselves upon you, shaping temperament, emotional tendencies, and mental stability. This was not metaphorical. The stars did not symbolize traits. They delivered them. If you were calm, anxious, impulsive, melancholic, or chronically unfortunate, the answer was already written overhead. You were not difficult. You were born at an inconvenient time. This belief transformed psychology into a form of cosmic bookkeeping. Mars explained aggression. Saturn accounted for sadness. Mercury handled restlessness. Venus managed desire. Each planet contributed its influence, distributing traits the way a clerk distributes forms. Personality became a schedule. Fate became a chart. And suddenly, everything made sense. Astrology psychology was appealing because it explained everything without asking anyone to change. If anger came from a planet, then it was not a character flaw. If sadness lingered, it was not weakness. If someone made poor decisions repeatedly, it was unfortunate timing. Responsibility floated somewhere between the heavens and nowhere at all. This was deeply comforting. Birth charts functioned like psychological profiles. They were consulted to explain behavior, predict compatibility, and even guide treatment. Certain days were considered better for interventions. Certain alignments favored action. Others required restraint. If a remedy failed, the timing had been wrong. If a person worsened, the stars had shifted. The system could not be disproven, which made it remarkably stable. Astrology psychology also solved a lingering problem medieval thinkers faced. Why did two people raised in similar conditions behave so differently? Why was one calm and another volatile? Why did effort sometimes fail to produce improvement? The answer no longer required speculation. The explanation had already been decided before either person had taken their first breath. This eliminated awkward questions. Why help someone improve if the universe had already weighed in? Why examine social conditions if destiny had handled the paperwork? Astrology did not deny complexity. It bypassed it. There was also an emotional benefit. Astrology softened blame without demanding compassion. You were not at fault for your temperament. Neither was society. The sky had arranged things this way. Acceptance became easier when resistance felt pointless. In this sense, astrology psychology was the most relaxing explanation medieval psychology ever produced. You did not have to monitor your thoughts quite so carefully. You did not have to analyze your fear endlessly. You did not have to trace every emotion back to bile or blood. Sometimes the stars were simply doing what stars do, and there was a strange peace in that. Of course, this peace came with a cost. If your personality was written in the sky, growth became optional. Reflection was unnecessary. Improvement was uncertain. Why struggle against a pattern that had been set before you existed? Astrology psychology encouraged resignation disguised as insight. It also reinforced hierarchy effortlessly. Those born under favorable alignments were naturally suited to leadership. Those born under heavier influences were destined for struggle. Success could be explained without merit. Failure could be explained without injustice. The universe, it seemed, had preferences. And yet, astrology psychology was rarely used to challenge authority. It explained outcomes without questioning systems. If someone suffered, it was unfortunate alignment. If someone prospered, it was fortunate timing. No one needed to ask whether the distribution was fair. Fairness was not part of the model. Astrology psychology also blended seamlessly with earlier ideas. Fluids, heat, blood, and fear could all be influenced by planetary movement. A person might feel stable one month and unbalanced the next, simply because something overhead had shifted. Emotional inconsistency no longer required explanation. It required a calendar. This removed urgency from self-examination. Why worry about today's mood when next week's alignment might fix it? Why confront patterns when the sky might adjust them? Astrology psychology offered patience without effort. Time, not understanding, became the solution. And for many people, that was enough. There is something almost gentle about this belief when heard late at night. The idea that your struggles are not personal, that your difficulties are not moral, that your temperament is not a failure. It is simply scheduled, comforting in a quiet way, but it is also revealing. Astrology psychology did not emerge because medieval thinkers were naive. It emerged because they were overwhelmed, faced with emotions they could not regulate, behaviors they could not predict, and suffering they could not resolve. They looked outward. The sky offered permanence, regularity, patterns that did not change in response to human pain. The stars did not care, and that, oddly, made them trustworthy. By attributing personality to the heavens, medieval psychology completed its escape from responsibility. The body could be corrected, the mind could be restrained, but destiny could be accepted. And acceptance is a powerful sedative. As we move forward, the pattern remains familiar. When systems fail to care, explanations expand outward. When understanding becomes difficult, certainty grows distant. The stars were never consulted because they were accurate. They were consulted because they were unreachable. And in a world desperate for order, nothing feels more reassuring than an explanation that cannot be argued with. If everything was written above you, then perhaps nothing was truly your fault. And that thought, whispered gently under the night sky, was enough to let many people finally sleep. When stars became too distant to manage, the mind was redesigned into something safer, a structure with rooms, walls, and limits. When medieval psychology could no longer blame fluids or stars, it redesigned the mind as architecture. After responsibility had been gently floated upward to the stars, medieval psychology eventually drifted back down to the head itself. Not to open it, of course. That would have been messy and unhelpful. Instead, it imagined the brain as something far more familiar and far more controllable. A building. Not a mysterious shifting process, but a structure. Solid, organized, divided into rooms. Because if the mind could be mapped like a house, then confusion was no longer frightening. It was just poor interior management. In this model, the brain was composed of chambers, each assigned a specific function. Memory lived in one room, imagination occupied another. Reason, naturally, took the front space, close to the senses, where it could look out and supervise everything else. The mind was no longer a storm. It was a floor plan. And suddenly, mental distress became a matter of maintenance. If you forgot things, the memory room was weak. If you hallucinated, the imagination room was overstimulated. If you made bad decisions, the reasoning chamber was poorly furnished. The problem was not the person, it was the layout. This idea was taken very seriously. Medical texts describe these mental rooms in precise detail, despite no one having ever seen them. The front of the brain handled judgment and reason. The middle processed imagination and sensory images. The back stored memory, neatly tucked away like old furniture. Damage to the head was frightening, not because it harmed tissue, but because it might rearrange the rooms. A blow to the wrong wall could redecorate your personality. This architectural model made the mind feel manageable. If each room had a function, then balance could be restored by regulating activity. Too much imagination? Close the door. Too much memory? Ventilate? Too much thinking? Absolutely not. Thinking was heavy furniture. Move it slowly. Learning, in this framework, was structural stress. Studying too much too quickly could overload a chamber. Reading late into the night strained the imagination room. Concentrating intensely caused heat to build up in the reasoning space. A mind filled too fast was not impressive. It was unstable. Better to learn carefully, gradually, under supervision. Education became a form of controlled renovation. Knowledge was not poured in freely. It was added cautiously, one item at a time to avoid collapse. A person who sought too much information too eagerly was not ambitious. They were reckless. Creativity, as always, was the most suspicious activity of all. Imagination was considered the most volatile room in the brain. Left unchecked, it filled itself with images, fantasies, and unnecessary associations. Stories, poetry, and daydreams furnished this room heavily, often without permission. Medieval psychology advised limiting exposure to stimulating material, especially for those already prone to wandering thoughts. In other words, stop redecorating. If imagination grew too strong, it interfered with reason. If reason weakened, decision-making suffered. And if decisions failed, the entire structure was at risk. The solution was not expression, it was restraint. The mind, like a house, needed order. This model also influenced how memory was treated. Memory was not dynamic, it was storage. Information was placed into the back room and retrieved when needed. Forgetfulness meant the room was poorly maintained. Too many memories cluttered the space. Too few left it empty and weak. To improve memory, medieval psychology recommended repetition, ritual, and sensory reinforcement. Strong smells, loud sounds, sharp experiences, because nothing strengthens recall like startling the furniture into place. Imagination, on the other hand, was to be softened, calmed, simplified. Patients were advised to avoid vivid imagery, dramatic storytelling, and excessive mental wandering. Thinking creatively was not enriching. It was destabilizing. Once again, moderation was the answer. This architectural mind had one great advantage. It explained everything. If someone behaved strangely, it was because one room had become dominant. If someone withdrew, Perhaps the memory chamber had closed itself off. If someone obsessed, imagination had taken over the house. Mental illness was no longer mysterious. It was structural imbalance. And structural imbalance could be corrected. Diet affected the rooms. Weather affected the rooms. Emotions affected the rooms. Cold made the brain damp. Heat dried it out. Excess thinking overheated specific chambers. The medieval brain was essentially a poorly insulated building with constant humidity issues. Treatments followed naturally. To strengthen reason, people were encouraged to practice discipline, routine, and repetition. To calm imagination, reduce stimulation. To protect memory, maintain order. The mind was not something to explore. It was something to manage. This model also reinforced hierarchy. Some people, it was believed, were born with sturdier structures. Their mental rooms were better constructed. Others had fragile designs. Too much pressure caused collapse. This explained why not everyone was suited for leadership, scholarship, or decision-making. The house, after all, had limits. There is something deeply human about this image. In a world without neuroscience, imagining the mind as a building made it visible. Rooms could be named. Problems could be localized. Fear could be contained within walls. But there is also something quietly revealing. By turning the mind into architecture, medieval psychology stripped it of motion. Growth became expansion risk. Curiosity became structural strain. Change became damage. Stability was prized above all else. A mind that stayed within its walls was healthy. A mind that pushed outward was dangerous. And so, the brain became a house that was never meant to be renovated extensively, only repaired, only reinforced, only kept standing. As we drift forward, this image lingers softly. The idea that thinking too much might cause collapse, that imagination must be contained, that learning should proceed slowly, carefully, under watch. It is a comforting image for a late night. A quiet building, lights dimmed, doors closed, rooms in order. In medieval psychology, peace did not come from understanding the mind. It came from keeping it structurally sound. And once the house was quiet, the system could finally rest. Once the mind was fragile and dangerous, the simplest treatment remained. Say less, move less, and disturb nothing. When medieval psychology ran out of explanations, it discovered that quiet people were much easier to manage. Once the mind had been redesigned as a building with delicate rooms and fragile walls, medieval psychology turned to the most efficient form of maintenance available. Not medicine, not correction. Silence. Speaking, according to medieval thought, was risky behavior. Words stirred thoughts. Thoughts activated rooms. Rooms generated heat. And heat, as everyone already knew, led to imbalance. A talkative person was not expressive. They were unstable. Too many words meant too much movement inside the mind. Silence, by contrast, kept everything still. A quiet person was seen as composed, orderly, and healthy. Their inner rooms were undisturbed, their circulation calm, their imagination contained. Silence was not emptiness, it was control. This idea fit perfectly with everything that came before. If thinking too much damaged the brain, then speaking too much only accelerated the damage. Better to reduce input and output entirely. Better to let the mind settle like dust in an unused room. And so silence became therapy. People experiencing distress were encouraged to withdraw from conversation. Talking about feelings was believed to intensify them. Expression was not release, it was provocation. Silence allowed emotions to fade by denying them movement. This approach was especially useful for maintaining social order. Those with authority were allowed speech. Those without were encouraged toward quiet. Silence was praised as discipline, obedience as calm, resistance as instability. If someone objected too loudly, perhaps their mind was unbalanced. If they questioned too persistently, perhaps their imagination room was unsupervised. Silence did not just heal individuals, it simplified society. This expectation fell unevenly. Women were encouraged toward quiet more than men. Emotional speech was treated as evidence of volatility. Silence was framed as protection. For their own good, they were told, expression should be limited. The same logic applied to anyone lower in hierarchy: servants, laborers, the young. Those expected to obey were also expected to be quiet. Speaking up was not disagreement. It was imbalance. In this way, psychology became an instrument of control without ever appearing forceful. Silence was presented as care, obedience as health. Calm was not just desirable, it was virtuous. There is something almost soothing about this belief late at night. The idea that quiet might bring peace, that withdrawing from noise could calm the mind. And in small doses, this was not entirely wrong. But medieval psychology did not recommend balance. It recommended suppression. Silence was not about understanding yourself. It was about containing yourself, keeping the mental building intact, keeping emotions from roaming, keeping questions from spreading. A silent person did not trouble the system. And a system untroubled rarely asks whether silence is healing or simply convenient. By the time medieval psychology reached this conclusion, everything had aligned. The mind was fragile, emotions were dangerous, thinking was risky, fear was weakness, and speech was movement. Silence was the safest solution left. And so, as the night deepened, medieval psychology asked for nothing more than this: be quiet, be still, behave. The system would take care of the rest. And in the end, medieval psychology endured for one quiet reason. Certainty is far more comforting than truth. Medieval psychology survived not because it was right, but because it was certain. By now, the pattern should feel familiar. Every emotion was explained, every behavior categorized, every deviation assigned a cause, a label, and a correction. Nothing was left floating. Nothing was allowed to remain unresolved. Medieval psychology did not leave space for doubt, and that was its greatest strength. It offered answers quickly, cleanly, confidently. Sadness had a cause, fear had a cause, thought itself had a cause. If something went wrong, the system already knew why, and if the explanation failed, the failure belonged to the person, not the idea. This created a world where uncertainty had nowhere to settle. That is why it worked. In a time filled with instability, disease, and fear, confidence was comforting. A system that spoke without hesitation felt safer than one that admitted uncertainty. People did not need accuracy, they needed reassurance. Medieval psychology delivered it with absolute certainty. There were no footnotes, no, "we're still studying this," no ambiguity, just answers. Delivered calmly, repeated often, defended firmly, and people slept better for it. What makes this unsettling is not how wrong medieval psychology was, but how recognizable it remains. We still gravitate towards simple explanations. We still prefer systems that assign blame clearly and resolve discomfort quickly. We still confuse confidence with truth. We still like being told that our problems have clean causes and manageable solutions, even when they don't. Medieval psychology did not fail because it lacked intelligence. It failed because it was human. It did what humans often do when faced with complexity and fear. It chose certainty. It chose order. It chose explanations that felt stable even if they were built on imagination rather than understanding. And that preference has not disappeared. As the night settles and the noise of the day fades, it becomes easier to see why such systems endure. Certainty is soothing. Doubt is tiring. Complexity keeps us awake. Simplicity lets us rest. So as you drift towards sleep, remember this gently. They were not foolish. They were very much like us. And that may be the most accurate psychology lesson of all. Good night.